Today's video is about a Tennessee stripper and the sheriff she trusted the most. She infected him with a secret he never saw coming, and days later, she was found dead, alone, silent, and terrified. But here's the question no one can answer. How far does a man in power go to protect himself, and what price does the truth demand? A forbidden affair, a hidden diagnosis, and a voicemail that could destroy everything. By the end of this story, you'll see that the deadliest secrets aren't shouted, they're whispered in the dark. The club closed the way it always did. Lights dimming, music bleeding into silence, bodies drifting back into the Tennessee night. She counted her tips alone in the locker room, fingers trembling, heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Sweat clung to her skin, makeup smeared beneath tired eyes. Tonight felt different. He hadn't come. She checked her phone again. No messages, no missed calls, just the buzzing silence she had learned to fear. For weeks, his presence had been unavoidable. His stare from the back of the room, his badge catching the neon glow, his authority pressing heavier than the bass in her chest. But tonight he was gone, and somehow that scared her more. She changed quickly, pulling on a hoodie that smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap perfume. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, her heels echoing as she crossed it alone. A chill ran through her as a dark SUV idled across the street. When its headlights flicked off, she told herself she was imagining things. She always did. Her apartment was small, quiet, and suffocating. She locked the door behind her, then checked it twice. The silence felt loud, like it was waiting for something. She poured a drink she didn't want and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall where shadows moved like memories she couldn't erase. She thought about leaving town, about disappearing somewhere no one knew her name, her work, or her mistakes. But fear had a way of rooting her in place. Fear and the certainty that running would only make things worse. Her phone finally lit up. A message, unknown number. "We need to talk tonight," her breath caught. She typed and erased a dozen replies before sending nothing at all. Instead, she opened a notes app and began writing, words spilling out in a frantic confession she didn't know who would ever read. She wrote about fear, about power, about mistakes that couldn't be undone, about a sickness that had already stolen more than her health. A noise came from the hallway outside her door. Soft, deliberate, she froze, phone clutched in her hand. Another sound followed, metal against metal, like keys brushing a lock. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard through the walls. "Who's there?" she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. No answer, just the click of the hallway light turning off. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time lost its shape. She stood, backing toward the kitchen, eyes fixed on the door. When her phone slipped from her fingers and hit the floor, she didn't bother picking it up. Survival had narrowed her world to breath and sound and shadow. The rest of the night would never be remembered clearly. Only fragments remained, pressure, panic, a sharp pain, the feeling of falling backward into darkness. When morning came, she did not see it. The body was discovered just after sunrise by a neighbor who heard nothing during the night. No screams, no sirens, no broken door. Police cars eventually lined the street, red and blue lights flashing too late to matter. Officers whispered, confused by how clean the scene looked. Nothing appeared stolen, and nothing appeared broken, disturbed, or violently forced. The quiet felt intentional, rehearsed, and disturbingly calm. One detail stood out almost immediately. The county sheriff, usually first to arrive at any major crime, was absent. His name was missing from the initial response log. And in a town where he was always everywhere, that silence was impossible to ignore forever by anyone present. The morning after her death, the sheriff stood before cameras with practiced composure, his voice steady, his expression carved from concern. He spoke of safety, of justice, of a tragedy that would not be ignored. To the town, he looked like a man burdened by duty. What they didn't see was how little he slept the night before. Weeks earlier, his visits had begun quietly. Always after midnight, always unofficial. The strip club sat just outside town limits, far enough to feel anonymous, close enough to control. He never wore his uniform inside, but the badge stayed in his pocket, heavy, reassuring. People noticed him. They always did. At first, he told himself it was curiosity, stress relief, a harmless escape from a marriage grown cold and a job that demanded constant dominance. She noticed him long before he spoke to her. The way he watched, not with hunger, but with expectation. When he finally called her over, it wasn't a request. Their conversations stayed brief, transactional. He tipped too much, asked too little, and lingered longer each night. She learned his routines, his moods, the subtle shifts in his temper. When he smiled, she relaxed. When he didn't, she prepared herself. Power didn't need to announce itself, it just waited. Soon, the private room visits started. No cameras, no witnesses, just dim lights and the quiet understanding that he could change her life with a word. He asked questions about her past, her health, her fears. Some nights he barely touched her. Other nights he stayed long after the music stopped. He began showing up elsewhere, outside her apartment. At the gas station she used, once at the clinic. Each encounter was framed as coincidence, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. She joked about it to coworkers, masking unease with laughter. Inside, something tightened. He told her secrets or what sounded like them, complaints about the town council, about deputies he didn't trust, about the loneliness that came with command. In return, she offered silence. Silence became currency. Silence became expectation. With every shared word, the line between protection and possession blurred further, leaving her unsure whether she was being confided in or quietly claimed. Then came the night he didn't pay. He sat across from her, jaw clenched, eyes dark. He asked questions she didn't know how to answer. Medical questions, accusations wrapped in confusion. When she tried to deflect, he leaned closer, voice low, reminding her who he was. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, as if authority itself had weight. In the days that followed, he watched her closely, measuring her reactions, testing her silence. Each glance felt like a warning. Each unanswered call felt like a threat forming. She began to understand that whatever connected them was no longer mutual, and that fear had quietly taken the lead. After that, his visits stopped being hidden pleasures and became something else entirely. Surveillance footage later showed his truck parked behind the club on nights he claimed to be on patrol. Phone records revealed calls he said never happened. Each visit tightened a knot neither of them could untangle. Control had replaced attraction completely, leaving no room for denial or escape anymore. The balance of power had shifted permanently and dangerously for both of them involved here. By the time the sealed medical report crossed his desk, fear had replaced desire. And somewhere between panic and control, the sheriff made a decision that would follow him into the dark days ahead. The question was no longer how often he visited her. It was what he was willing to do to make sure no one ever knew why. 3 days after her death, the sheriff sat alone in a fluorescent-lit clinic room, staring at a poster about prevention he refused to read. The air smelled like disinfectant and quiet judgment. When the doctor returned, the words were delivered softly, professionally, without drama. HIV positive. The diagnosis landed without sound, yet it shattered something inside him immediately. He nodded as if he understood, as if his badge could still protect him from biology. Questions followed, but he barely heard them. Timelines blurred, names echoed. Faces from the past flickered through his mind, then settled on one. Her. The realization tightened his chest until breathing felt optional. He drove aimlessly afterward, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Training told him to stay calm, to control narratives, to anticipate threats. This was a threat he couldn't arrest. By nightfall, panic had calcified into resolve. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He found her behind the club, smoking alone beneath a flickering security light. She froze when she saw him approach, recognition replacing surprise. He didn't waste time. He told her about the test, about the diagnosis, about what it meant. Her face drained of color as denial tumbled into fear. She swore she hadn't known, swore she would never have risked him intentionally. Her voice cracked, hands trembling as she spoke. He listened, but listening wasn't the same as believing. Every word felt like a lie waiting to destroy him. When she mentioned a past relationship, his temper surfaced. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, reminding her of consequences she didn't ask to hear. Licenses, charges, immigration questions. The words were carefully chosen, each one pressing against her until she nodded just to make him stop. That night, she cried alone in her apartment, replaying the conversation until it lost meaning. She searched the internet obsessively, reading symptoms, timelines, outcomes. Fear gnawed at her sanity. She realized then that her body wasn't the only thing under threat. He returned days later, calmer, controlled, wearing concern like armor. He suggested solutions, silence, discretion, cooperation. He said exposure would ruin them both, but only one of them would survive it. His smile never reached his eyes. She began documenting everything afterward. Dates, conversations, glances. The way his tone changed when he felt cornered. She didn't know why she did it, only that instinct told her to. Survival often speaks quietly. The sealed medical report was filed under restricted access, locked behind authority and trust. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everything had. The diagnosis had shifted something fundamental, turning attraction into terror and control into obsession. He reviewed every interaction afterward, replaying conversations like evidence tapes, searching for where control slipped. Sleep abandoned him. Food tasted like nothing. Each knock on his door felt like exposure arriving early. He imagined headlines, courtrooms, his family learning the truth. The badge on his dresser no longer symbolized safety. It felt like a witness. He considered confession, then dismissed it. Confession required mercy, and mercy was never guaranteed. What he understood clearly was leverage. Information could be buried, people could be discredited. Stories could be reshaped. He had done it before for others, quietly, efficiently. This time, the stakes were personal. The fear driving him was no longer about disease, but about losing command. And in that fear, justification grew roots, whispering that drastic actions were sometimes necessary to preserve order. Every decision ahead would be framed as duty, even as conscience faded and consequences gathered patiently in silence around him each night. By the time he realized she might talk, fear had already taught him a dangerous lesson. Power could erase problems if applied early enough, and somewhere in that belief, a line was crossed that could never be stepped back over again. After the diagnosis, the world around her began to shrink. Every street felt watched, every sound sharpened by suspicion. She stopped answering calls from friends, stopped laughing at work, stopped trusting quiet moments. Fear followed her like a second shadow, always a step behind, never leaving. The sheriff never raised his voice again. He didn't have to. His power lived in pauses, in looks held too long, in questions that sounded casual but weren't. When he asked where she'd been, she answered. When he suggested she take a few days off, she obeyed. Silence became a survival tactic, rehearsed and perfected. At the club, whispers followed her between rooms. Management asked gentle questions she couldn't answer. Customers felt different now, less distant, more invasive. Every touch reminded her of what she'd lost control over. She felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with nudity. The calls began soon after. Unknown numbers, heavy breathing. Hang-ups. Once a voice asked her if she knew how fast rumors spread in small towns. She blocked the number. Another replaced it minutes later. She stopped sleeping more than an hour at a time. She tried to leave town one morning, throwing clothes into a bag with shaking hands. As she opened the door, a patrol car rolled slowly past her building. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. The message landed anyway. She sat on the floor and cried until her throat burned. He framed everything as protection. He said people were curious, that stories traveled, that it was better if he stayed close. Close meant everywhere. The grocery store, the pharmacy. Once, the parking lot of a clinic she hadn't told anyone about. Each encounter chipped away at her certainty, replacing it with dread. She began to doubt her own memories. Had he threatened her or only implied it? Had she imagined the tone, the intent, the danger? Gaslighting wrapped itself around her thoughts, tightening until clarity felt unreachable. Even fear started to feel unreliable. At night, she wrote again, longer entries now, detailed ones. She described conversations word for word, times and locations precise. She hid copies in places she thought no one would look, inside books, behind loose tiles, in the lining of a purse she rarely used. The act of writing grounded her, reminding her she still existed. One evening, she noticed a car parked across the street for hours. Engine off, lights dark. When she stepped onto the porch, it drove away slowly. She didn't chase it. She went inside and locked the door, hands shaking too hard to hold the key. The sheriff stopped contacting her for several days. The silence was worse than the pressure. It left space for imagination, for dread to bloom unchecked. She knew enough by then to understand patterns. Silence meant something was shifting. A news report played softly on her television about corruption charges in a neighboring county. An official brought down by a woman no one believed at first. She watched it twice, heart pounding, recognizing herself in the blurred details. That night, she scrolled through her contacts and stopped at a name she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who knew her before the club, before the secrets. Before the fear, she hesitated, thumb hovering, aware that reaching out could change everything. She sent a single message. I have proof, and I don't think I'm safe. Outside, the town slept unaware, wrapped in trust it hadn't earned. Inside her apartment, fear packed its bags and courage took its place, fragile but present, preparing her for consequences she could no longer outrun without looking back. The phone stayed silent afterward, but the decision echoed loudly. Whatever came next would no longer be quiet, and silence was no longer enough to keep her alive. The reply came before dawn, one word. Meet, no name, no reassurance, just a location pinned to a forgotten stretch of road outside town. Relief and terror arrived together, equal in weight. She packed the evidence carefully, hands steady despite the shaking inside her chest. They met at an abandoned diner, windows boarded, sign rusted into illegibility. He was already there, older than she remembered, eyes sharper, posture cautious. Time had hardened him, but recognition softened something briefly. He didn't hug her, he listened. She slid a folder across the cracked counter. Inside were copies of medical timelines, call logs, screenshots, and notes written in ink that bled through thin paper. She explained everything without embellishment, voice flat, conserving emotion like fuel. He asked questions only when necessary. He understood immediately what she was up against. Small towns protected their own, especially men with badges. Evidence had to be handled carefully. Exposure could be fatal. He promised nothing except discretion, and somehow that felt honest. They agreed to keep distance. No calls, no messages. If something happened, he would know what to do. She left lighter and heavier at once, the secret file no longer hers alone. For the first time in weeks, she slept. 2 nights later, she noticed the first sign something was wrong. The folder she kept hidden behind the bathroom tile was gone. The space was too clean, too intentional. Panic surged, then calculation. Only one person knew where to look. She called him. It rang once before cutting off. Again. Straight to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Fear sharpened into clarity. The sheriff hadn't just been watching her. He had moved. By morning, rumors rippled through the club. Deputies had been asking questions, quiet ones, about her habits, her associations. Management suggested she take time off, concern layered over warning. She nodded, compliant, already planning. She checked her other hiding places. 2 copies remained. She wrapped them in plastic and drove without destination, stopping only when exhaustion forced her to. At a rest stop, she noticed a patrol car across the lot. It didn't approach. It waited. Her phone buzzed, a blocked number. A text appeared, "You should stop digging." She didn't respond. She deleted nothing. She drove back into town at sunset, resolve replacing fear. If silence invited erasure, then movement might buy time. That night she recorded a voicemail she never sent. She named names, dates, intent. She said she was scared. She said she didn't want revenge, only safety. She saved it under a meaningless label and backed it up twice. Unbeknownst to her, the man she trusted was already being questioned. Pressure had found him first. The file he'd hidden vanished from his car while he slept, doors locked, windows intact. A message waited on his windshield in the morning. "Stay out of it." By the time she realized the secret file was no longer secret, the ground beneath her had shifted. Control was changing hands, quietly, efficiently. And someone had decided the risk she posed was growing faster than they could contain. She locked her door and sat in the dark, documents clutched tight, understanding too late that evidence alone did not guarantee protection. It only painted a target. She checked the locks again, then the windows, rehearsing excuses she might need. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled, then went quiet. She felt the town closing ranks, decisions being made without her. Tomorrow would bring questions, maybe comfort, maybe violence. Whatever arrived first would demand a response she wasn't sure she had left to give. Time thinned, patience vanished, and the line between witness and casualty blurred as footsteps passed her door, slow and deliberate, pausing just long enough to be heard before moving on into darkness. Tomorrow she would have to decide how loud to scream, or whether there would be time at all. The discovery came with daylight, and the town reacted the way it always did, slowly, cautiously, trusting the badge to explain what didn't. Patrol cars blocked the street, neighbors whispered behind curtains, and the sheriff arrived last. He stepped from his truck, face drawn with concern, eyes carefully composed. He took control immediately, assigning tasks, sealing rooms, narrating events before questions could form. To everyone watching, it looked like leadership. To anyone paying attention, it felt rehearsed. The scene was clean, almost respectful, as if violence had been edited out. He studied her body briefly, then looked away, jaw tight, breath measured. Inside, panic pressed hard, but habit kept him standing. By mid-morning, he was briefing deputies, his voice calm, authoritative, carefully avoiding details that might invite speculation. He dismissed early questions about timelines, explained away gaps with procedure, reminded everyone to respect the victim. Her name was spoken softly, then less often. Evidence was logged, photographs taken, statements gathered. He controlled the flow of information like a valve, opening only what he needed. When a deputy mentioned the lack of forced entry, the sheriff nodded unsurprised. He suggested familiarity and acquaintance a private matter. The idea settled quickly, comfortable, convenient. No one challenged him. Authority has gravity. It pulls doubt inward. Outside, reporters gathered, hungry for outrage. He kept them. Still, cracks formed quietly. A junior officer noticed the sheriff's phone buzzing during interviews. Another logged a patrol vehicle near her apartment the previous night. The details were small, easy to dismiss, but they accumulated. The sheriff felt it happening, pressure building behind his ribs. He compensated with kindness, shaking hands, offering reassurance, promising justice. At home, he scrubbed his hands raw, replaying hours and alibis until sleep refused him. The badge lay heavy on the dresser, no longer comforting. When internal logs flagged his delayed arrival, he closed the file himself. Control restored briefly. Fear, however, learned his schedule. It waited. It watched. It remembered. Tomorrow would test him. The autopsy complicated everything. Results suggested a staged scene, careful placement, an absence of chaos. It wasn't proof, but it contradicted the story he had offered. He downplayed it publicly, framed it as speculation. Privately, he felt the walls inch closer. Whispers reached his office, then his home. A witness mentioned a familiar truck. He smiled, thanked them, and filed it away. Power meant deciding which truths mattered. That night he burned notes in the sink, watching paper curl into ash. Smoke stung his eyes, or maybe it was regret. He told himself this was containment. Order, duty, the lie steadied him. Barely. Morning brought sirens, not outside. Inside, louder. Publicly, he remained untouchable. Privately, the investigation began to drift beyond his reach. County officials asked questions. State forms arrived requesting copies of reports. He delayed, redirected, cited workload. The town trusted him, but institutions required paper. Each request felt like erosion. He sensed eyes on him, measuring, weighing. The woman's past resurfaced in whispers, framed to diminish her, protect him. It worked until it didn't. When an external agency called to assist, his pulse spiked. Assistance meant oversight. Oversight meant loss. He agreed, smiling into the phone. Afterward, he sat alone, breathing shallow. Control was slipping. He felt exposed like a suspect. The thought tasted metallic, unavoidable, close, coming. By evening, rumors outran facts. Someone leaked the sheriff's absence that first night. Someone else questioned his closeness to the victim. He heard it in pauses, saw it in eyes. He doubled down, calling it slander, promising arrests. But certainty had cracked. As darkness settled, a call came from the state. An investigator would arrive at dawn, fresh eyes, neutral hands. He thanked them, ended the call, and stared at the wall. The room felt smaller. He thought of her notes, her voice. He wondered what else existed. Outside, a cruiser rolled past, slow. He didn't follow. He understood then that leadership had tomorrow. The badge would no longer decide. The state investigator arrived before sunrise, unannounced except by the car idling outside the sheriff's office. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and neutral eyes, the kind trained to listen longer than they spoke. Her presence shifted the building's rhythm instantly. Conversations lowered, doors closed more carefully. Trust began to hesitate. She asked for everything: logs, evidence inventories, timelines. The sheriff provided them with practiced ease, explaining delays, clarifying procedures, filling silence with confidence. She listened without reacting, marking notes without comment. Experience had taught her that certainty often hid rot beneath polish. Interviews followed. Deputies spoke respectfully, but small inconsistencies surfaced. A patrol sighting that didn't align. A call logged later than remembered. The investigator didn't accuse. She let the gaps breathe. By afternoon, whispers had hardened into quiet concern. The sheriff felt it in the way people avoided his eyes, in how questions lingered after answers ended. Authority still shielded him, but it no longer sealed him. Cracks had appeared, fine but unmistakable, running through the badge he'd worn unquestioned for years. Old complaints resurfaced next. Anonymous tips forwarded from internal affairs. Women describing intimidation, pressure, lines crossed but never documented. Each allegation alone was thin. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name aloud. The investigator requested files quietly, without urgency. That frightened him more than confrontation ever could. At home, he drank too much and slept too little. Dreams blurred into memory, memory into fear. He replayed his choices, wondering which ones would be misunderstood, which ones could still be defended. The difference narrowed until it disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, the town changed tone. The victim's name appeared in print, paired with words like vulnerable and exploited. Sympathy replaced judgment, slowly but visibly. Candlelight appeared outside her apartment. Someone taped flowers to a doorframe no one opened anymore. Public emotion had shifted, and it was no longer on his side. The investigator visited the strip club next. Surveillance footage played without sound, faces flickering across a screen. She paused on his truck, parked too long, too often. She didn't ask him about it. She didn't have to. The silence did the work. By evening, the sheriff was no longer directing the investigation. He was participating in it. Forms were signed. Access was shared. The illusion of control collapsed quietly, without ceremony. He felt exposed, reduced to explanations that sounded thin even to himself. A new detail emerged from the autopsy review. The positioning of the body suggested intent, not impulse. Care, not chaos. Someone had wanted the scene to speak calmly, to mislead gently. The investigator underlined it twice. Then came the voicemail rumor. An officer mentioned hearing about a recording, unconfirmed, possibly deleted, possibly misplaced. The sheriff denied knowledge, heart racing. If it existed, it could unravel everything. If it didn't, the idea alone was enough to sink him. Night fell heavy. He sat alone in his office, badge on the desk, hands folded like a man waiting for judgment. The investigator knocked once before entering, expression unreadable. She informed him of a procedural change, federal interest, a review board, nothing formal yet. As she left, she turned and asked one final question almost casually. "Did you know her before the club?" The pause lasted half a second too long. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, unrelated but unmistakable. For the first time, he felt the badge no longer protected him. It reflected him instead, showing fractures he could no longer hide. And somewhere beyond the building, the past was still speaking, waiting to be heard. The rumor hardened, spreading through hallways like smoke without flame. By morning, investigators confirmed a voicemail existed, recorded before death. No one admitted hearing it, but several officers remembered whispers. The file appeared in evidence logs, then vanished without explanation. Security footage showed no tampering, which only deepened the unease. Someone with access had removed it cleanly and confidently inside. The investigator requested backups, knowing voices have a way surviving. A technician recovered fragments from a server flagged for deletion. The audio was damaged, incomplete, but unmistakably her trembling voice. She spoke carefully, as if afraid walls themselves might testify. Names were hinted, not spoken, fear interrupting sentences mid-breath. She described pressure, threats disguised as protection, power disguised care. At one point, she whispered that she not feel safe. The recording ended abruptly, as if interrupted by sudden realization. Investigators sat quietly afterward, letting her absence fill the room. Word of the voicemail reached the sheriff before sunset arrived. He denied knowledge immediately, anger flashing too quickly behind eyes. The investigator watched his reaction, noting rhythm, breath, and timing. Denials were expected, but panic leaked through practiced calm behavior. That night, rumors swelled into certainty among deputies and staff. Someone had heard more than admitted, and guilt travels quickly. The voicemail became a ghost, haunting every conversation and report. Federal agents requested the audio formally, escalating stakes immediately nationwide. The sheriff felt control slipping, replaced by exposure and dread. He searched memory for mistakes, wondering what else she saved. Across town, the investigator prepared warrants, timelines, and confrontations ahead. The past refused burial, speaking louder the more silenced became. Her voice, fractured yet persistent, had changed the investigation permanently. Tomorrow would demand answers no badge could defer any more alone, and the truth was finally preparing to introduce itself publicly. Morning lights revealed nothing new, yet everything felt irrevocably altered. The sheriff avoided mirrors, afraid of recognizing the man inside. Deputies exchanged looks, loyalty wrestling doubt in quiet hallways there. Paperwork multiplied, each signature another nail loosening authority slowly daily. The investigator scheduled re-interviews, focusing on nights previously ignored entirely. One deputy remembered a voicemail backup policy never followed properly. That memory opened doors thought permanently sealed shut before now. Technicians returned to servers, digging deeper than authorization allowed initially. Bits of audio surfaced, timestamps aligning with her final hours. Each recovered second tightened the net around the sheriff slowly. He requested legal counsel quietly, framing it as procedural caution. The town noticed the shift, interpreting silence as guilt collectively. Vigils grew larger, candles multiplying along sidewalks and porches everywhere. Her name was spoken with respect, not judgment, now finally. Pressure mounted for transparency, answers, and consequences beyond apologies alone. The investigator prepared a briefing, aware resistance would intensify soon. She replayed the voicemail fragments, memorizing cadence and fear therein. This case was no longer local, contained, or controllable alone. The sheriff sensed the end approaching, though timing remained uncertain. He wondered which truth would surface first, hers or his. Outside his office, footsteps paused, then moved onward slowly again. He closed his eyes, imagining her voice filling courtrooms eventually. The voicemail had survived death, refusing disappearance like truth does. Tomorrow promised confrontation, clarity, and consequences long deferred until now. The investigator set her alarm early, prepared for resistance ahead. Across town, the sheriff packed documents he hoped irrelevant were. Sleep eluded both, haunted by voices, gaps, and light flickering. Morning would decide who controlled the narrative next after everything. The badge waited silently, reflecting fractures under unforgiving lights above. Her voice waited too, patient, persistent, impossible to bury any more. Momentum shifted decisively, carrying the investigation forward without mercy now. Questions demanded answers, and answers threatened powerful foundations everywhere nearby. The next step would not be quiet or polite anymore. Someone would finally have to answer for her silence publicly. By the time the investigator reached him, the former lover had already decided to talk. Fear had hollowed him out, leaving honesty as the only thing that felt heavier than silence. He asked for protection first, not forgiveness. The investigator didn't promise safety, only process. That was enough. He told the story in pieces, voice unsteady, eyes fixed on the floor. How she had called him weeks earlier, frantic, convinced she was being watched. How she had trusted him with copies of files she believed could keep her alive. He admitted hiding one set in his car, thinking distance would protect them both. It hadn't. Pressure came fast after that. An unmarked vehicle outside his apartment, a polite knock that carried a warning beneath it. The folder vanished overnight, doors still locked, windows untouched. A message left behind made the meaning clear: stay quiet or else. He stayed quiet until guilt became unbearable. His testimony changed the shape of the case immediately. It filled gaps the voicemail couldn't, gave context to threats that had sounded abstract. The investigator listened, careful, relentless, documenting every word. Truth once spoken demanded structure. In exchange, he received scrutiny. Old charges resurfaced. Deals were reconsidered. Friends disappeared. Telling the truth cost him stability, anonymity, and whatever future he thought he had secured. Still, he didn't recant. Fear had already taken enough. The sheriff learned about the testimony through channels that no longer belonged to him. He felt the shift instantly, like a floor dropping inches without warning. Control evaporated, replaced by inevitability. He drafted statements, rehearsed denials, then abandoned both. Spin couldn't outrun corroboration. Federal interest solidified. Subpoenas followed. Phone records, location data, access logs, patterns emerged where coincidence once hid. Each new document tightened the narrative, turning implication into sequence. The investigator assembled timelines with care, knowing defense would attack precision. Public pressure mounted. Protest signs appeared beside candlelight. Editorials questioned power and accountability. The town's trust fractured openly now, no longer whispered. The sheriff's family withdrew from view. He stopped answering calls. Behind closed doors, counsel advised resignation. Not an admission, they said. A strategic retreat. Step away before being pushed. Preserve options. He stared at the badge, weighing legacy against survival. The cost of telling the truth had become universal. He announced his retirement 2 days later, effective immediately. The statement spoke of health, family, service. It said nothing of her. Reactions split along predictable lines, relief and outrage colliding in equal measure. The investigator read the notice twice, unimpressed. Retirement changed nothing procedurally. If anything, it cleared the path. Without the shield of office, cooperation became compliance. Warrants moved faster, interviews sharpened. The sheriff felt exposed, reduced to a name without a title. He packed his office at night, avoiding eyes. In private moments, doubt crept in. He wondered whether stepping down would slow the storm or invite it. He reviewed old cases, searching for leverage, for loyalty that might still hold. Each memory felt transactional now, stripped of meaning and protection. Local media requested interviews. Advocacy groups demanded charges. Lawyers debated technicalities on late-night broadcasts. The case stopped belonging to the town, expanding outward into a symbol bigger than any one person. The former lover entered protective custody, life narrowed to rooms without windows and rules without flexibility. He asked once if it would be worth it. The investigator didn't answer. Worth was a luxury justice rarely afforded. As the town adjusted to the absence of its most powerful figure, a final question lingered. Was retirement an end or an escape? The investigator prepared the next move, aware that accountability often resists quietly before it arrives loudly. Tomorrow would test which truth held longer, his story or hers when pressure finally peaks. The resignation did not slow him down. If anything, it accelerated something restless and dangerous beneath his calm exterior. With no office to report to and no deputies watching his movements, he began to prepare quietly. Boxes were packed, files sorted, documents shredded with practiced efficiency. What he couldn't destroy, he organized, labeling memories into categories that made sense only to him. The investigator noticed the shift immediately. Travel records flagged unusual activity. Bank withdrawals appeared in careful increments just below reporting thresholds. A storage unit was rented under a familiar alias. None of it was illegal, all of it was deliberate. Justice often announced itself loudly, but escape preferred silence. Federal warrants were finalized within days. They moved carefully, knowing haste could give him exactly the opening he wanted. Surveillance increased, subtle but constant. Cars rotated. Phones pinged towers. Still, he stayed one step ahead, movements measured, expressions neutral. He smiled at neighbors, waved at old friends, played the role of a man stepping away with dignity. Behind the scenes, the narrative tightened. Prosecutors debated charges, weighing what could be proven against what was merely known. The voicemail fragments, the testimony, the patterns of intimidation, all compelling but fragile. They needed one more anchor, one undeniable link tying motive to action. The investigator believed it existed. She felt it in the gaps he'd failed to close, in the evidence that disappeared too cleanly. Someone always made a mistake when they thought they were finished. She focused on timing, on the narrow window between the voicemail recording and the time of death. Alibis were tested again, harder this time. Public patience thinned. Justice delayed began to feel like justice denied. Protests grew louder, angrier. Her face appeared on posters, her name spoken with urgency. The case had become a referendum on power, and power does not yield gracefully. He watched it all from a distance, insulated by walls and legal counsel. At night, he rehearsed departure routes, border crossings, places where his name would mean nothing. He told himself he was protecting his family from spectacle. He told himself he deserved peace. The lies felt thin, but repetition strengthened them. The call came late. A federal agent informing him of pending charges, not yet public, an opportunity framed politely to surrender voluntarily. He thanked them and ended the call without committing. His hands shook afterward just once. By dawn, he was gone. The news broke quickly. An empty house, a vehicle abandoned miles away, credit cards unused, phones left behind. The town reacted with fury. Escape confirmed what doubt still resisted. Justice, once patient, turned feral. Manhunts are theater and math combined, resources mobilized, borders alerted, old contacts questioned. The investigator coordinated silently, refusing to speculate. She focused on pressure points, on people he trusted when trust still mattered. Days passed, then weeks. Leads surfaced and dissolved, a sighting here, a rumor there. Each disappointment sharpened resolve. Justice did not need speed, only endurance. And then, a call. A clerk at a remote motel reported a man asking questions too carefully, paying in cash, avoiding cameras imperfectly. The description matched almost. The investigator felt the familiar tightening in her chest. This was either the end or another ghost. As teams mobilized, she reviewed the case one last time, listening again to the broken voicemail. Her voice cracked on a word that still wasn't clear. A name, maybe, or a warning. The truth hovered just out of reach. Justice or escape was no longer his choice alone. The next move would decide whether the story ended with answers, or with silence that lasted far too long. The motel lead dissolved by morning. The clerk had been mistaken, or afraid, or both. Surveillance cameras showed only shadows and assumptions. By the time investigators arrived, the room was empty, sheets untouched, silence reclaimed. The manhunt slowed, then settled into something quieter and colder. Absence became the loudest evidence left behind. Weeks turned into months. The case remained open, but momentum thinned. Resources shifted elsewhere. New emergencies demanded attention. Justice, once relentless, learned patience the hard way. The sheriff was never officially found. No body, no arrest, just a name that slowly stopped appearing in headlines. The town adapted, vigils ended. Flowers wilted. The strip club closed under new ownership, painted over in neutral colors. Her apartment was rented again. Someone else slept where fear had once lived. Life, indifferent and efficient, moved forward. Officially, the case concluded unresolved. Statements cited insufficient evidence to proceed without the suspect present. The voicemail fragments were archived. The testimony was sealed. Truth existed, but not in a form the system could finish. Justice, it seemed, required a body willing to stand still. Years later, the investigator revisited the file alone. Retirement loomed. Loose ends demanded revisiting. She replayed recordings one last time, listening not for names but for intention. The broken voicemail played through static and gaps, her voice thin but deliberate. This time, something clicked. The pauses, the order of words. The way she framed blame around herself first. It wasn't just fear speaking. It was confession. She hadn't been trying to destroy him. She had been trying to stop something. Medical records resurfaced, re-examined without assumptions. A detail long dismissed sharpened into clarity. The timing of her diagnosis, the language she used, the way she spoke of responsibility. The investigator felt a cold understanding settle in. The stripper had known. She had known she was infected long before the sheriff ever was. And she had been trying to tell him, trying to force a conversation before anyone else got hurt. Trying to break a cycle that had already consumed her. Her silence wasn't manipulation, it was shame. Fear. Trauma layered so thick it disguised intention. When the sheriff learned the truth, panic had overtaken reason. In his mind, exposure wasn't just personal ruin, it was public contamination of power. Control had replaced compassion instantly. Protection had become punishment. Her evidence wasn't leverage, it was insurance. A desperate attempt to survive long enough to explain herself. The investigator closed the file slowly. The system had missed the most human truth buried beneath scandal and fear. The town had judged a woman easier than it questioned a badge. Power had written the narrative, and silence had finished it. Somewhere, perhaps, the sheriff lived under another name, carrying a secret heavier than guilt. Somewhere else, a woman's voice remained archived, reduced to metadata and static, still trying to be understood. Justice never arrived cleanly. It rarely does. What remained was the cost of truth delayed, of power unchecked, of silence mistaken for guilt. The case became a lesson whispered in training rooms and ignored in practice. A reminder that truth does not always save lives. Sometimes it only explains why they were lost. The investigator shut off the light and left the office for the last time, carrying nothing but understanding. Outside, the world continued without pause, unaware of what it had chosen not to hear. And somewhere in that quiet, her voice remained, unfinished, unresolved, and finally devastatingly clear.